I thought catching my wife cheating was the worst thing that could happen, until I was framed for her murder. Now, with corrupt cops, a relentless DA, and secrets unraveling at every turn, clearing my name might cost me everything. I found myself sitting in a police interview room in the heart of the Midwestern city I'd called home my entire life. Beside me was my close friend and attorney, Ralph Boston. Ralph leaned in and, for the second time in 5 minutes, whispered, "Lucas, I strongly advise you to keep quiet and let me handle this. Exercise your right to remain silent. I'm Lucas Worthington." The name might sound like something out of a business magazine, especially with my rarely used middle name, Rockefeller. My parents are loaded, but that's not where my wealth comes from. At 29, I've amassed over $50 million on my own as a dot-com entrepreneur. But don't get the wrong idea, I don't consider myself part of the elite. I'm just a regular guy who happens to have a lot of money. I drink beer, shoot hoops, cheer from the stands at baseball games, and sometimes end up in the occasional brawl. When I'm not working, I dedicate more than 40 hours a week to volunteering, primarily through a charity I founded to support underprivileged kids in my city's rougher neighborhoods. Now, here I was, about to be interrogated by 2 detectives over the grisly murders of my wife, Ashley, and one of her lovers, Brad Sidley. The crime happened just a couple of nights ago at Sidley's apartment. Despite the gravity of the situation, I couldn't summon much remorse. Ashley had turned into an unfaithful opportunist not long after we got married. I'd already planned to file for divorce on grounds of infidelity within the next couple of weeks. As for Brad, he was a loudmouth egotist who'd provoked me one too many times. I'd had to put him in his place, twice, but it had little to do with Ashley and everything to do with his obnoxious attitude. The door opened, and in walked Detective Roy Benson, a seasoned investigator with years of experience under his belt. Trailing behind him was Detective Will Watson, a relatively new addition to the department but with a solid background as a police officer. Watson had only recently been promoted to detective, and this case was bound to be a trial by fire for him. I wasn't sure how Detective Watson had landed the job. He looked polished and had the kind of charisma some people found charming, but to me, he was as sharp as a sack of hammers. My eyebrows arched as I suppressed a grin. This was going to be interesting. Detective Benson started things off. "As I understand it, Lucas, you're willing to speak with us, even with your lawyer present?" I leaned forward, meeting his gaze evenly. "First of all, Detective Benson, I'm not your buddy. Address me as Mr. Worthington," I said, but before I could finish, Watson let out a chuckle. A condescending, tilted smirk settled on his face. Turning to Watson, I stared him down and said, "You know, Will, every time I see you, it takes me back to that movie Animal House." Confusion flashed across Watson's face. He opened his mouth to speak, but I continued, "It reminds me of that line Dean Wormer told Flounder, 'You can't go through life fat, drunk, and stupid, son.'" I paused for effect, then added, "The quote's not perfect, but close enough. You remind me of Flounder. So, for the sake of keeping this interrogation productive, I suggest you keep that fat, clueless mouth of yours shut, or I might have to remind you of what happened in the locker room back at Hudson High, junior year after football practice." The memory lit a fire in my mind, though I doubted Watson shared my nostalgia. Back then, Watson had called me a horny weakling and decided to shove me around. It ended with me throwing him flat on his back, pinning him down, and giving him a swirly in the locker room toilet. Sure, I got benched for the next game, but it was worth it. "That's enough, Mr. Worthington," Benson snapped, his voice taut with authority. "Then tell your sidekick here to zip it," I shot back, locking eyes with Benson. "I'm happy to answer your questions, but I won't tolerate his antics. Not now, not ever." I let out a low growl, and Watson's face twisted, brimming with anger. He looked like he might lunge at me, but I knew better. Watson wasn't the type to act on his rage, too much cowardice hiding behind that uniform. Now, you might wonder why I'd antagonize a cop who could make my life a living nightmare, but trust me, there's a reason. You'll understand soon enough. Benson leaned over and whispered something to Watson, who sank back into his chair, glaring daggers at me. I took a moment to re-establish control of the room. As I was saying before I was so rudely interrupted, I continued, this interview is happening solely because your department agreed to record the entire process. Let me make something clear, if I catch you lying to me, even once, this conversation ends immediately. Also, I expect your questions to be efficient, because I'll only be here for 2 hours. Benson's irritation was obvious as his brow furrowed. We don't agree to time limits, he said, his tone sharp. I raised an eyebrow and smirked. Then clearly, you either didn't speak to Chief Jackson or you weren't paying attention, because these terms were made clear to him, and he agreed. Do you accept them, or should I leave now? For 30 tense seconds, we locked eyes, each sizing up the other. Finally, Benson sighed and nodded. Fine. Let's get started. I removed my watch, setting the timer function with a flourish, and placed it on the table. Then proceed. Benson began his line of questioning, with Watson only whispering the occasional suggestion. He must have realized by now that I wouldn't answer a single word that came from him. I responded to every question honestly, even as it became clear neither of them believed a word I said. But I wasn't concerned. They could doubt me all they wanted, they'd never find a shred of evidence to prove I was the one who killed my cheating wife or her insufferable lover. An hour into the interrogation, Watson whispered something to Benson, and the detective leaned forward. How do you explain your DNA being found on Sidley's clothes? Benson asked, his voice steady, but his eyes full of challenge. I calmly stopped the timer on my watch, slid it back onto my wrist, and rose to my feet. And that, I said coolly, is your first and only lie. Goodbye. Without another word, I turned and walked out, Ralph following close behind. Benson and Watson shouted after me, but I didn't bother listening. Their words held no significance. As Ralph and I strolled to his office, just a few blocks from police headquarters, we couldn't contain our laughter. By the time we entered his private conference room and shut the door behind us, Ralph burst out laughing, his voice echoing in the small space. Ralph leaned back in his chair, shaking his head with a mix of disbelief and amusement. I can't decide if you're the bravest or the most reckless client I've ever had. I flashed a grin. Can't I be both? Ralph smirked but pressed on. Seriously, Lucas, why were you so confident dealing with those cops? 2 reasons, I said, leaning forward. First, because I didn't do it. And second, I have an unshakable alibi backed by video evidence for the entire time frame of the murder. The medical examiner pegged the time of death between noon and 3 p.m. on the 5th of this month, and during that window, I was 90 miles away at a basketball clinic. The whole thing is on video. Ralph raised an eyebrow. Where's the video from? It's footage from the clinic, I explained. A police videographer, who moonlights as a freelancer, recorded the entire session at my request. I hired him because I wanted to use the footage for presentations at boys and girls clubs across the country as part of my charity's outreach. The filming started at 11 a.m., broke for lunch at 12:30, and wrapped up before 4 p.m. I've got a dozen copies of the video locked in my safe at home. Ralph nodded thoughtfully. Good. Then I'd better grab a copy for safekeeping. Mind if I come along to retrieve it? I chuckled. Only if I get to treat you to lunch first. Dealing with Benson and Watson must have worked up an appetite. Ralph grinned. You've got yourself a deal. 2 days later, at 6:30 a.m., my doorbell rang. I wasn't surprised to find Detective Watson and half a dozen officers standing on my porch with a search warrant in hand. Judging by their smug expressions, it was clear they'd planned this as an early morning ambush, likely hoping to catch me off guard. Unfortunately for them, I'd already been up and training for half an hour. Sweat-soaked and still catching my breath, I opened the door to Watson's self-satisfied grin. "Morning, Mr. Worthington," Watson said, holding out the warrant like a trophy. "We're here to take a look around." I glanced at the document, then back at him. "Have fun, genius," I muttered, brushing past them to retrieve my bike. "I've got a workout to finish outside. Try not to take anything. All the valuable stuff is catalogued." Watson's grin faltered slightly as he replied, "You've got quite the attitude for someone under investigation." I smirked. "And you've got quite the nerve. Don't break anything." Then I pedaled off, leaving Watson and his crew to do their worst. I wasn't the least bit concerned about leaving the police to search my house. Not only because I had nothing to hide but also because I'd installed high-tech cameras in every room. Those cameras were how I'd first caught Ashley cheating, though I'd never told her, or anyone else, about the footage. When I returned from my bike ride a little over an hour later, the officers were already wrapping up. Watson spotted me and, with a smug grin, handed me a sealed evidence bag. Inside was a handgun. Since I didn't own a firearm, I knew immediately it had been planted. But I wasn't worried, my cameras had recorded everything, including when and how the weapon had been discovered. After checking the footage, which took about an hour, I called Ralph and brought him up to speed. 2 days later, we got word through Ralph's contacts at the station that the police were planning to arrest me. They'd arranged to do it at my charity in broad daylight, aiming to maximize the spectacle by tipping off 2 local news stations. Ralph and I, however, were one step ahead. We showed up at the station just as the task force was preparing to move out. Their frustration was palpable. I couldn't help but smile as their plans for a dramatic, public takedown unraveled. Ralph had already filed a motion with the court's most senior judge, and by the end of the day, we'd ensured the case would proceed on our terms. At the bail hearing, the district attorney himself showed up. It was an election year, and he clearly intended to use my case to bolster his profile. The DA, who had crossed paths with my father years ago when he was still in private practice, treated the proceedings as a media spectacle, making disparaging remarks about me at every opportunity. I was furious, but Ralph stayed calm and professional, countering every claim with precision. The DA's grandstanding was transparent, and Ralph dismantled his arguments one by one. In the end, the judge set a reasonable bail, which I paid immediately. As I walked out of the courthouse, I made a point of shaking the judge's hand. The 2 jailers who'd been escorting me looked on in shock, their mouths agape. It was clear they weren't accustomed to seeing a defendant so composed, or so confident. Unlike most people facing charges, I didn't shy away from the spotlight. I leaned into it. I gave interviews to anyone who asked, TV stations, radio hosts, newspapers, social media influencers, you name it. In every interview, I made sure to tell my side of the story, highlighting the inconsistencies in the investigation and casting doubt on the DA's motives. I wasn't just defending myself in court, I was shaping public opinion. In every interview I gave, I didn't hold back. I openly called the district attorney an incompetent fool who had no business in office, urging voters to replace him in the next election. I also accused the detectives on my case of being corrupt and ineffective, laying out the inconsistencies in their investigation. Meanwhile, I made sure to praise Ralph for his professionalism and brilliance in handling my defense. Despite the bold statements I made in the media, Ralph and I were composed and polite when addressing the legal proceedings directly. At the next court hearing, Assistant District Attorney Suzanne Carney presented the highlights of their case. She outlined the evidence in a clipped, confident tone. The murder weapon, a .380 caliber pistol, had been found in my home during the police search, with ballistic tests confirming it was used in the crime. My DNA was also allegedly found on the gun. Carney argued that while the video of my alibi covered me until 1:50 p.m., it left enough time for me to return to the city and commit the murders by 3 p.m., as estimated by the medical examiner. She emphasized my supposed motive, Ashley's affair with Sidley, and the claim that eliminating her was financially advantageous, as it was cheaper than a divorce. It was a solid-sounding argument on the surface, but Ralph and I knew its weaknesses, and so did the judge. After the hearing, Ralph and I met with Carney to finalize some procedural paperwork. While waiting for her secretary to bring in the documents, I engaged Suzanne in a pleasant, light-hearted conversation, punctuated by frequent smiles. It was a deliberate tactic to unbalance her and soften the tension in the room. She was polite but clearly trying to maintain her professional demeanor. 5 minutes later, her secretary, a young man, entered with the necessary paperwork. After a quick review, Ralph and I signed, with the secretary and one of Carney's assistants acting as witnesses. As the secretary stepped out to make copies, I turned back to Suzanne. "You know," I said with an easy smile, "I'd really like the chance to get to know you better." Her eyes widened, and for a moment, she just stared at me, her mouth slightly open. 2 full minutes passed before she regained her composure. "Are you serious?" she asked cautiously. "Or is this some kind of trick?" I held her gaze, my expression unwavering. "Oh, I'm serious," I replied smoothly. "For instance, I know your favorite band is Bon Jovi. Would you like to hear some tracks? I've got their entire collection on my phone." I turned to Suzanne with a confident smile and added, "I'll even buy us 2 front-row tickets to Bon Jovi's next concert in New York, courtesy of a friend who can make it happen. The show is in exactly 123 days, and I'd love for you to join me." Suzanne blinked in surprise, her composure momentarily shaken. Before she could respond, Ralph gave me a look, subtly urging me to stay on topic. "There's something important we need to address," I said, pivoting back to the case. "The DVD we submitted as my alibi was cut off prematurely. It appears to end at 1:50 p.m., but if you continue playing it for another 30 minutes, it resumes and shows me on camera until 4 p.m. The prosecution and police must have stopped it as soon as they hit static, missing the rest of the footage." Ralph chimed in, "We'll need to ensure the complete footage is entered into evidence and reviewed." I continued, "Another misunderstanding stems from the assumption that Ashley and I didn't have a prenuptial agreement. There is one, though the only people aware of its terms were my lawyer and me. The financial witness claimed I'd have had to pay Ashley a fortune in a divorce, but the prenup tells a very different story. In the event of infidelity, her payout would have been limited to $50,000. For any other reason, it would have been a mere $1,000. At trial, Ralph introduced the prenuptial agreement into evidence, catching the prosecution off guard. The move not only discredited their financial motive argument but also highlighted their failure to thoroughly investigate. Ralph further undermined the prosecution's witness, whose testimony about my financial liability was exposed as baseless. Then came the moment with Detective Watson, whose testimony centered around the discovery of the gun. He described finding it, picking it up with gloved hands, and placing it into an evidence bag. His testimony was brief, lasting just 20 minutes, but Ralph's cross-examination proved pivotal. Holding the remote for the courtroom's projector, Ralph began, "Detective Watson, can you recall what you were wearing on the day of the search?" Watson hesitated. I don't remember." Ralph clicked the remote and a photo appeared on the screen, showing Watson outside my house on the day of the search. In the image, he was surrounded by officers, clearly identifiable by their uniforms. "Do you recognize yourself in this photo, Detective?" Ralph asked. "Yes," Watson admitted. Ralph's tone sharpened. "And do you have any reason, Detective, to have been inside my client's house at any time outside the lawful execution of this search warrant?" The room fell silent. Watson shifted uncomfortably, clearly unsure how to respond. Ralph's line of questioning planted a seed of doubt about the integrity of the investigation, further unraveling the prosecution's case. Ralph's voice grew sharper as he pressed Detective Watson. "You've never been inside the Worthington residence other than on the day of the search, have you, Detective?" Watson shifted uneasily in his chair, avoiding eye contact. After a pause, he muttered, "No." Ralph's lips curled into a grim smile as he clicked the remote, projecting footage onto the courtroom screen. Here's a video of someone removing a green toothbrush from Mr. Worthington's bathroom. The grainy footage showed an individual entering my bathroom and taking the toothbrush. "Is that you, Detective Watson?" Ralph asked, his voice rising with intensity. Watson squirmed in his seat as the video played. The unmistakable outline of his figure filled the screen. "That's your distinctive build, is it not, Detective? And those are your actions?" I claim the Fifth Amendment," Watson stammered, his voice barely audible. Ralph raised an eyebrow and then turned to the judge. "No further questions, Your Honor." The tension in the courtroom was palpable as Suzanne Carney rose, visibly flustered. "Your Honor, may we request a recess?" she asked, her voice shaking. "You certainly need one, Miss Carney," the judge replied dryly. "We'll reconvene in 2 hours." The gavel struck, and the courtroom dissolved into murmurs as the jury exchanged glances, some smiling, others shaking their heads. Later, behind closed doors, Suzanne approached me with an unexpected plea agreement. "We're offering this deal because we suspect you had some sort of inappropriate connection to Detective Watson," she said. Her words lit a fire in me. Rage boiled over, and I lunged forward, shouting, "How dare you!" Ralph, standing at my side, grabbed my arm and held me back, his strength the only thing stopping me from completely losing control. Suzanne's face paled as she took a step back, clearly startled. Ralph's calm voice cut through my fury as he whispered, "Let it go, Lucas. We've got them cornered." As we walked away, Ralph kept me focused. He reminded me of the testimony from the videographer, an official police department employee from the city where my basketball clinic had taken place. On the stand, the videographer had made it clear, the footage didn't stop at 1:50 p.m., as the prosecution claimed. It continued, showing me present until 4 p.m., with additional interaction captured until 4:30 p.m. This irrefutable evidence dismantled the prosecution's timeline entirely. When the jury returned with a verdict of not guilty, the judge nodded in approval. "Miss Carney, I'm waiting in my chambers," she said curtly, banging her gavel. Relief swept over me, but I couldn't ignore the sour expression on Suzanne's face as the courtroom cleared. On the courthouse steps, the press eagerly awaited statements. Ralph, ever the professional, seized the moment to address the media. He condemned the prosecution and police for their mishandling of the case, pointing out that, had they been honest, the charges never would have been filed. His words were carefully measured, but the underlying criticism was clear. For my part, I gave my thanks to Ralph and took the opportunity to highlight the injustices I'd faced. The press lapped it up, feeding their headlines with my every word. The case may have ended in my favor, but the fallout had only just begun. The truth about the investigation, Watson's misconduct, and the prosecution's failures were now laid bare, with questions lingering about what had really motivated their actions. But for now, at least, justice had been served. When Shirley entered the room, I noticed immediately how striking she was. Up close, she was even more captivating. As we shook hands, I held hers just a little longer than necessary, perhaps even longer than was appropriate. "What brings you here, and what do you have to do with my business?" I asked, studying her carefully. She smiled politely. "I'm an intern, fresh out of law school, here as an observer. My internship ends next week," she explained. Her composure was impressive, though I caught the faintest hint of nerves. Miss Carney, however, sent me with a message. "Miss Carney?" I said, raising an eyebrow. Too embarrassed to face me herself. Shirley hesitated before replying. "To be honest, she's too afraid after your outburst on the last day of the trial." I leaned back in my chair, considering her words. Afraid? Why was she such a cold-hearted piece of trash before I called her out? If she had any integrity, she would have confronted the DA and dropped the case after Watson's testimony exposed the lies. Now, after all that, she suddenly wants to apologize. She does, Shirley replied softly. She realizes now that pursuing the case was wrong and wants to express her regrets sincerely. After a long pause, I asked, so, what does she want from me? She wants to know what it would take for you to drop your lawsuit against her. I smirked. And why is she sending you instead of coming herself? Shirley hesitated before answering. Because, frankly, she's terrified of you. I shook my head, letting the moment hang in the air before continuing. Tell her this, if the DA issues a public apology admitting their wrongdoing, I'll consider dropping the case. And one more thing, Watson needs to be charged with the murder of my ex-wife, not just the falsification charges he's currently facing. Those conditions are non-negotiable. Shirley tilted her head, chuckling softly. Are you serious, or are you teasing me? My tone was deadpan as I replied, completely serious. I turned to my computer, typed out everything I had just said, printed it, and signed the document with today's date. Handing it to her, I added, this is my final offer. Otherwise, I'll see them both in court. Shirley glanced at the paper, her lips curling into a faint smile. Noted, she said before making a quick phone call. I watched as she relayed my terms in a calm, measured tone. When she hung up, she returned her phone to her purse, but a moment later, I heard my own phone buzz. Curious, I checked the screen. The message was from her, containing her address and a playful smiling emoji. I looked up to see her smiling subtly as she gathered her things. Between Tuesday's meeting and the time she left the office, I couldn't shake the sense that Shirley's presence was more than professional. I picked Shirley up on Saturday evening, feeling both anticipation and a hint of caution. After everything with Ashley, I wasn't about to dive headfirst into another relationship without doing my due diligence. A private investigator I'd hired provided a comprehensive report on Shirley earlier in the week. She wasn't another gold digger, and that gave me some peace of mind. More importantly, Shirley intrigued me. In the brief time we'd spent together, I felt a genuine connection, a spark I hadn't experienced in a long time. As the evening unfolded, Shirley proved to be as engaging as I'd imagined. At one point, she leaned in and said with a sly smile, you know, Lucas, we already know so much about each other, don't we? I raised an eyebrow. Do we? Yes, she said, laughing softly. I mean, I already know most of the relevant facts about your life, thanks to the police and the prosecution's investigation during your trial. And I'm sure you've had people look into my background, too. So, why don't we skip the formalities? Let's talk about what really matters, what makes us tick, what makes us happy. Our goals in life. Important things, like where we went to school or how many siblings we have. Her candidness caught me off guard, but I couldn't help but admire her directness. Fair enough, I said, leaning back in my chair. Let's skip ahead. The evening was going better than I'd expected, but then Shirley surprised me again. After a pause, she took a deep breath and asked, have you ever had love on the first date? The question hung in the air for a moment. I took a second to process it, then answered with a measured calmness. No. Why do you ask? She smiled, her cheeks tinged with a playful blush. Because, she said, leaning slightly closer, we already know each other as well as people who've been dating for months. The only thing we don't know is how compatible we are, in other ways. She glanced at me, her eyes sparkling with mischief. Between the sheets, she continued, her voice lowering, or on the kitchen table, or in the pool, or... I cut her off with a chuckle, shaking my head in amusement. You're full of surprises, aren't you? Shirley smiled again, this time with a bolder confidence. As the evening progressed, she leaned into me, her touch gentle but deliberate. Her every movement seemed calculated to test the waters, and when she reached for my shirt, she did so slowly, her gaze locked on mine. Her hands moved methodically, removing the fabric by touch alone, her eyes never leaving mine. Her calm intensity made me decide to speak my mind. "You're unlike anyone I've ever met," I said softly. And in that moment, I meant every word. "I want you," Shirley said without hesitation, her voice low and teasing. "On the kitchen table." I raised an eyebrow, grinning. "Bent over it, or lying on it?" "Why not both?" she replied with a playful chuckle. "Or are you one of those guys who insists on doing everything yourself?" I laughed, then pulled her closer, kissing her deeply. Her hand slid to my belt, unbuckling it with practiced ease. "You're full of surprises," I murmured as her eyes sparkled with mischief. What followed was unlike anything I'd experienced before. Our connection was electric, and we moved together with an intensity that felt almost primal. I was vaguely aware of the rhythm in my head, something akin to Bruno Mars' Locked Out of Heaven, the beats echoing our pace. Shirley's inarticulate cries spurred me on, and when we both reached our climax, her body trembled as if consumed by waves of pure energy. The experience left me breathless and euphoric, almost as though I'd lost consciousness for a moment. Afterward, we lay there in a haze, basking in the afterglow. The world outside seemed to disappear as we shared quiet, stolen moments together. The next morning, over breakfast, I broke the comfortable silence. "Since we had such a great weekend, I almost forgot to ask, did you pass on my suggestions to Suzanne?" Shirley swallowed a bite of her English muffin and nodded. "I did. Suzanne was thrilled and promised I'd be offered a full-time position next week." "Good," I said, sipping my coffee. She chewed thoughtfully, then added, "She did ask me to keep quiet about it for now, though. Apparently, everyone knows you're the reason the DA's career is about to implode, and she doesn't want to stir the pot just yet." A wry smile crossed my face. "Well, that's hardly a secret," I said. "But it's good to know she's finally making the right moves." Shirley grinned and leaned over to kiss me. It was clear this weekend was only the beginning of something neither of us could have predicted. Shirley took a sip of her coffee, her expression thoughtful. "Suzanne warned me not to mention the job offer to anyone just yet. With the election coming up, the DA might decide to put it on hold if he thinks it could backfire politically." I nodded, understanding the delicate balance of office politics. But as I watched Shirley, a new thought struck me. "You know," I said, smiling, "I've been toying with the idea of giving you a ring, after we've lived together for a few months." Her eyes lit up, and she leaned in for a kiss. "Let's see where this goes," she said with a grin, her tone teasing but warm. After one last lingering kiss, she stepped out the door, her confident stride and her perfectly firm figure making it impossible not to watch as she disappeared into the building without looking back. As soon as the door clicked shut, I stood there for a moment, thinking deeply. Finally, I pulled out my phone and dialed the number that now held the top spot in my contacts list. Shirley answered almost immediately. "Listen, Shirley," I said, unable to keep the smile out of my voice, "I just had a better idea. Why don't you move in with me next weekend?" There was a pause, then her soft laugh filled my ear. "And why would I do that, Lucas?" "Because," I replied, "we both know this is heading somewhere. Why not start now?" Fast forward to the trial's conclusion. The case against me had collapsed under the weight of evidence exposing Watson's corruption. It turned out he'd manipulated the scene to frame me, but in his recklessness, one of his shots had passed through Sidley and struck Ashley, killing her. As the jury filed back into the courtroom, Shirley stood beside me, her presence as steadying as ever. When the foreperson announced the verdict, "Not guilty," relief washed over me like a tidal wave. I turned to Shirley, giving her a big hug and a kiss, my hand resting gently on her belly. "I'm so proud of you," I whispered, a smile spreading across my face. Later, as we returned from a celebratory tea, we learned that the jury had reached their decision in record time. It was a vindication not just for me, but for everyone who had believed in the truth.